Welcome back to Good Distinctions, where good distinctions are the spice of life. I'm Will Wright, your host, and joining me today is Jen Arnold. Jen, welcome.
Hi, thanks.
So, Jen, who are you?
My name is Jen. I live in Phoenix, and I graduated from Franciscan with my master's in catechetics and also theology, and I started writing. After I graduated, I realized I needed a place to use my skills, so I asked my pastor if I could start writing for our church bulletin, and he said yes. And before I knew it, I had a bunch of articles, and I put them on my website, Catholic Heart Ablaze, and now you can go there and you can read over 200 articles. I post every week. You can subscribe, have them delivered to your inbox, and you can follow me on LinkedIn, where I post them every week.
Excellent. So, CatholicHeartAblaze.com.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that I asked you on today, and it's wonderful to have you, you are preparing a series for Lent uh, on the spiritual life according to St. Francis, written by St. Bonaventure. So it's like double stacking holiness. Really excited about this. And I should mention also, I met you just before I got my master's in catechetics and evangelization and theology and Christian ministry from Franciscan. So I followed in your footsteps and copycatted you. But
Thank you.
it's been a lot of fun, and I always love connecting with other people who did the MACE program.
Yeah.
So what is this book? I know you have it with you, so if you can show
So
us.
this is the book. It's The Life of St. Francis of Assisi by St. Bonaventure, TAM Classics. I believe
Perfect.
this book was assigned for one of my courses, but I don't remember which one. And it's been a go-to ever since. This is my third time reading it all the way through, but then I go back to it often to reference it. I wouldn't call it an easy read just because the language is dated, but it's not an incredibly difficult read. It's not a biography in the sense of telling St. Francis's life from beginning to end. It's got 16 chapters highlighting different aspects of St. Francis's approach to things, his virtues. There's a chapter on receiving his stigmata, which I don't cover in my series. But it's basically a manual of how to be like St. Francis of Assisi more than a biography.
Well, and I heard this story, and I'm not sure. I think it's true. I haven't been able to source it, but Saint Francis apparently went on a mission of sorts to convert the Sultan, Muslim
Oh,
Sultan,
mm-hmm.
and he thought that he would be killed in the process and thus become a martyr and go straight to heaven. No such luck. The Sultan just thought he was kind of a funny guy, and he went home. But I think it shows a lot about who Saint Francis is. This is not a comfy kind of guy. No, pretty intense.
Yeah. And I'll actually cover that story. That's in his in the virtue of charity, I believe is what it was. And he was seeking martyrdom. And the Sultan did admire his passion for what he was doing, and that's why he wasn't killed. But Francis received a vision, or which chastised him and said, "Go home. You're not to be martyred." So he was seeking martyrdom, but that wasn't God's will for him, and so he went home in obedience and did not receive the martyrdom he desired. But yeah, he's an intense guy. So my husband and I, and maybe this was part of what inspired this, took a trip this past summer to celebrate our 20th anniversary, and we hit several pilgrimage spots in Europe. And one of the places we went was Assisi, and it it was incredible. So St. Francis's church is kind of in the bottom, and then a church was built on top of that, and then a church was built on top of that. So to go visit Francis's tomb, you have to go, down into the depths where his church actually was, and it's stark and cold and stone, and his casket is just gray, plain stone. It's got bars around it to keep it, And then you kind of emerge out of there into Assisi, which is now this tourist destination where there's shops and goods and fun things and wine. And that's where I had the best goat cheese of my life, was out at the restaurant in Assisi. And I'm like, St. Francis is probably rolling over in his grave right now.
All the
But
decadence and goat cheese.
it was a lot of fun, but it definitely spoke to kind of the man he was, in contrast to the world that we live in today. So,
well, and you were saying before we started recording that his spiritual sister, Saint Clare, had a very different tomb. So it even kind of shows, I think, his heart, that he was accepting this extreme poverty for himself, but he didn't expect it of everyone.
yeah, his brothers for sure, but Claire was treated a lot. Let's just say, her tomb looks much different from Francis's. She's got a decorated, ornate tomb with her like kind of image across the top, and there are flowers, and you can definitely see the contrast of the masculine versus the feminine. Now, there is like a room off to the side of Claire's that shows that she did wear the tunic and lived a very austere life and a poor life, but she was very honored in her death, whereas he preferred to just keep his humility about him and be as simple as and plain as possible. So it was a definite contrast.
One of the things that I love about St. Francis, I'd like to get to the book a little bit, but just for those listening, I think one of the things that was really emphasized in the program that we did with Franciscan was just the Franciscan spirit of the incarnational principle, which I love. Is as Catholics, we have this sacramental worldview where we understand that we're body and soul, and that these things matter. As Peter Crave says, we're embodied souls or ensouled bodies, whatever way you slice it. And so this incarnational principle is seeing that because Jesus became man and then ascended in his humanity to return to heaven in the Godhead, it's like that's what we're called to as well, that divinization, that, as St. Athanasius said, we become God so that, or God became man so that man could become like God. And so this incarnational principle was alive and well. And Francis lived some time ago. And he was the first one that we know of to have like a nativity set or a nativity scene, which I think is also a neat detail. It's the one time of year, of course, that all Protestants become Catholic, and idols are okay. Just kidding. Statuary and these things. But like that incarnational worldview is so vital. And I'm sure that comes through in the book.
It does. Yeah. And speaking of the nativity, in Assisi, they have a nativity displayed outside of his childhood home, which is pretty cool. It's not his, I don't think, but it was just, it was there as a reminder that he created this. But yeah, it does come through as I go through the virtues. You'll see that everything starts. I find, and I'll get to it, that he approaches each virtue a little bit differently than we do today, because he always starts with God, even before he starts with other. So we'll get through that. But yes, he very much, God is at the center, and God is owed everything above anything else. And then that made him more like God, like you said, and earned him, I think pretty sure he's the first one to receive the stigmata. So, he was rewarded for doing that.
So with this series, I mean, you said it's, I think you said there's 16 chapters. I mean, it's a
Yeah, there are
substantial
16.
text. So how
Yeah.
did you choose what goes in the series?
So the way I did it was I chose to focus on his virtues, because Lent is a time to root out sin, but in order to root out sin, we have to replace it with something else. We can't just, or we'll have a black hole. So we have to cultivate virtue to fill in where the sin was. And so kind of the front end of the book is, how he developed the habit and whatnot. And then the end of the book is, the stigmata and the miracles that were kind of performed after his death. So I really zoned in on the middle 6 chapters that highlighted each of these virtues that he demonstrated. And it doesn't explicitly say this, but I think St. Bonaventure put them in a hierarchical order where they built on top of one another, leading to the greatest. So, which led to his stigmata. So I start with chapter 5, which is his austerity, and then I just move on from there, and I will tell you all about it.
Excellent. Well, what is the sequence? I mean, without getting too much into the spoilers, I don't want to rehash the whole thing, but
no, it's okay. Let's see. So we've got his austerity, and then his humility and obedience, poverty, piety, charity, and then the thing that powered it all was his fervor and diligence in prayer.
So whenever I learn about the virtues and whenever I sort of investigate this, I always immediately think of humility as the first one, right? Seeing ourselves as we are before God and no more, no less, that this is who we are. And I want to say it was G.K. Chesterton in his biography of St. Francis kind of gives this visual, which Mumford and Sons also use in the song "The Cave," of Francis like coming out of the cave, walking on his hands, seeing the world hanging upside down, understanding dependence when you know the Maker's hand. That everything rests on, like you were saying, like everything is around God, everything clings to God, and then kind of understanding ourselves in light of that. So, what? How does Bonaventure define austerity? Like, what is it?
So before, I think you're right. I think we usually start with humility, but I think it's important to understand what Francis was before he was the Francis that we know. So he was a wealthy merchant who, by his own admission, was a sinful man, living the life. He wanted success. He wanted money. And then his conversion was slow. It took a series of several events to finally get him to let go. So I think we start with austerity because it's where Francis had to start. He had to shed the old to take on the new. And so I think we start with the austerity mostly because of who Francis was. So austerity is a strictness of life, a way that we live that kind of cuts off our sensual passions and our needs and our wants, that so that we can focus on God, right? So if we're constantly seeking comfort, good food, comfortable clothes, and comfortable bed, then we're focused on us, right? And so Francis wanted to focus on God. So Francis, he fasted and fasted and fasted. He would not cook his food. He would eat as much raw food as possible. He wouldn't flavor it. He wore a rough, thin tunic, be exposed to the cold and the discomfort on his skin. He would sleep sitting up or without a pillow. Like when he had a pillow, it would torment him. So he would get rid of the pillow. So what it does is it cultivates a detachment from the world and the worldly comforts that we experience, which are good. But when we're too attached to them, well, then there's trouble. So when we seek our comfort. So that's why St. Francis starts with austerity, and he really lived it. Now, in our own life here today, before anyone seeks extreme austerity, they should seek a spiritual director.
Yes.
um, don't do anything crazy. But, here now, there are things that we can do to deny ourselves, especially during Lent, because this is a
Yeah.
Lenten series. Fasting, this is why we give things up. And then there are things that we can do just day to day, just to, detach, right? You can sleep on the
Mhm.
floor for one night a week, or get rid of your pillow, or take cold showers, as Exodus 90 likes to tell people to do. Take a cold shower. Things that make you a little bit uncomfortable so that you detach from those comforts of the world and focus more on God.
Well, and there's definitely a very strong spiritual power in that. I mean, it really does work. I've done Exodus 90. I did Exodus 90 once all the way through. And then I did it two more times part of the way through.
My
Um,
husband too.
and I said I'm never doing this again. It's too much all at once to do more than once, I think. But
It's a lot.
I like my bed and my pillow and tasty food, and I'm a soft, weak-willed fella, I guess. But Exodus 90. So first time I did it, absolutely hated it for like a month. It was just the worst. I'm like, why am I doing this? Especially the cold showers. And then I was like, okay, hold on. I live in Phoenix. Are they ever really that cold? Probably not. Get over it. But I found myself really struggling with the lack of the technology bit,
Mhm.
especially the phone and the computer. And I didn't realize I had no sort of self knowledge in this area clearly because I would instinctually just sort of grab for my phone, which wasn't there because I didn't have it on me. And my hand was just sort of doing this clutching thing. I'm like, okay, I need to detach and go do something. Um, but after a while, it sort of becomes second nature. And then when I went back after Exodus 90 and Easter, I found myself using it far less. I mean, I have an iPhone, so screen time, like it actually tells me how long I'm using the phone and on what. And it was a massive drop even after I went back to it. So, on the one hand, like psychologically, there's a lot of fruit from detaching from these things, becoming healthier, finding a moderation, and then spiritually seeing that as well, that we're able to focus more on what's around us. Um, so I love that he begins with that. It makes a lot of sense. Like you're saying, he's a wealthy. His family were cloth merchants, right? Is that yeah?
Yeah.
So like he had a lot of money
Yeah, he
and a
did.
lot of things. So when
A
God
lot of things.
says, you know, let it all go, that's a lot to
It's
let
a lot.
go.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you were saying about the technology. So this occurred to me many times as I was writing this series, was how much easier it must have been for Francis without an iPhone. I'm like, this is a different world. And actually, for this Lent, our whole family is putting our technology on grayscale,
Hmm.
just to make it more bland and boring and whatnot. We're not going to go Exodus 90 on it, but we're going to definitely make it more difficult. But yeah, technology is a big obstacle for us today that Francis didn't have, but he had his own problems, all the fineries that he had to give up. So um,
There's a fun little accessibility shortcut on iPhone that you can set the side button. If you click it three times in succession, it triggers whatever function. And so I did that one Exodus 90 where if I click it three times, let's see if it works. Yeah, it goes to grayscale. I don't know if you saw that.
oh
And then I can turn it back on.
oh, I don't want
So,
anyone to do that though. Don't turn it back
well,
on.
no, but what I found is that even after Lent, so if I find myself looking at the phone too much, I don't have to go into any settings. I just click it three times and I'm back to grayscale.
Hmm.
And I'm kind of like sort of allowing a reset. Um, So that's been useful for me anyway, because I did that one time. And it's funny how when it's not bright and shiny and flashy and colorful, we don't want to look at it.
Well, that's what my husband, he's had it on grayscale from time to time, and he's like, it is so boring that you don't even want to be on it. And I'm like, great, let's all do it. We're doing it. And the kids were like, sure, okay. So I'm gonna go for it.
Well, and it's interesting, and I'm really excited to read what you have to write and to dive into this book at some point too. Maybe over Lent, that'll be kind of my adventure. But I love my phone. Okay, maybe I shouldn't say I love my phone, but like I love what it can do.
Yeah.
It helps me be organized. It keeps me on track with good distinctions and all sorts of other things. Keeps me in contact with my colleagues and my wife and my parents. So like, there's a lot of good that can come from it. But again, the austerity that Francis is calling us to is to detach from the things that are distracting us from God.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we? Maybe this comes up in the series, but like, how do we cultivate that? How do we fill in the hole, so to speak?
I mean, it's just an intentional choosing to. So I use the analogy of the pebble in the shoe. You put a pebble in your shoe and you walk around all day with it in your shoe and you intentionally choose discomfort,
Hmm.
which is so contrary to our nature, right? But you do that. And that's the analogy that I use, but it's whatever speaks to you. So
Hmm.
like I've talked to friends about this, one night a week, sleep on the floor. One day a week, take a cold shower, fast we've lost Wednesday fasting, right? Wednesday
Yeah.
abstinence from meat is something that has um, dropped off in modern times, where we should probably reinstate that. And I heard the reason that we used to abstain on Wednesdays was to atone for the sin of Judas, which took place on Wednesday, right?
Hmm.
So before Holy Thursday, he had to do his betrayal, which was on the Wednesday. And that's why the church practiced these things, and we just lose sight of these things. So it's an intentional choosing something,
Hmm.
and the more the better. Again, without a spiritual director, be careful, but like, choose to detach from a worldly comfort and make yourself uncomfortable. Don't cut the tag out of your shirt that's itchy, or all these different things that you can. Don't put spice. Don't season your steak very well. Make it bland. Whatever it is. That's what
Hmm.
Francis used to do. Oh, he would not drink cold water because it was too refreshing. He would just drink warm water. So there's things that you can do. You just have to be intentional about it and
Hmm.
embrace it and do it because Jesus did it. Because Jesus wasn't comfortable on the cross. When he was doing that for you and for me and for everyone else, Jesus wasn't comfortable. And so the least we can do is put the pebble in our shoe, you
Hmm.
know, is how I kind of look at it. So it's about just intentionally choosing this. So,
Well, and I will say, when I did Exodus 90 the first time, I went into asceticism and trying to read the Desert Fathers and sort of learning from the greats of asceticism, like, what is it? How does it work? Why are we doing it? And it was so wonderful. It was so freeing, um, because, as you say, it unites yourself with the cross of Christ in such a tangible way. I mean, obviously, we're not suffering the lengths that he did, but there's no wasted suffering. That's one of the beautiful things about being Catholic, is all of the suffering that we offer up intentionally becomes a prayer, becomes grace for us and for the world, and for those most in need of it. And how awesome is that?
mm-hmm,
Um, but asceticism, the root of that word is ascesis, of practice, of training like an athlete.
mm-hmm,
Um, and so one of the things I want to talk about though is, so like you've mentioned this multiple times, make sure you do this under a spiritual director. Why is that so important? because I'll share real quick about sort of my own experience. Like I I used to have pretty awful scrupulosity um, when I was in college for a time, and it was debilitating. Um, and scrupulosity is a spiritual disease for those listening, where you see something that's good and you think it's evil, or you see something that's evil and you think it's even worse than it actually is. It's this sort of compounding issue. So you be going to confession and confessing things that aren't even sins. So there's something seriously disordered there. And it takes a lot to get out of that because you can't get out of it by yourself. It takes grace and it takes someone else, it takes a mentor or a spiritual director to sort of lift you out of that, or a good confessor who can see that as, okay, this is not someone being pious. This is someone actually suffering from the disease of scrupulosity. And I could see someone easily going towards that, especially if they've lived a very lackluster life thus far and they have a big conversion experience and they decide, all right, I'm all in for Christ. I need to do everything humanly possible. And they go way overboard. So, anyway, that's all the thoughts that are kind of jostling around in my head. So,
I think you're definitely correct that the scrupulosity does play a huge role. But there's also a flip side of that where it could appeal to pride. I'm so holy. I'm doing all
yeah,
these
right.
great things. And then, God's actually not willing this for you. You're willing it
Hmm.
for and I don't even want to say appearances sake, because it doesn't necessarily show on the outside, but it comes from a place of self as opposed from God's will, right? So a spiritual director will help you discern, as they get to know you, as they get to know your prayer life, will help you to discern what you're being called to by God versus what you're being called to from your own sense of pride and things. So I think it can be either or. I think you can
Hmm.
go one way on scrupulosity, and I think you can go the other way on pride. So it's the little things are fine to take
Yeah.
on by yourself, but if you start like getting crazy, it's time to find help.
Well, and that there was a good distinction. So, thank you for that. Um, so, if people want to set about sort of practicing this, when I worked at a parish, this was a question that I would get asked a lot is, okay, I want a spiritual director. How do I find one? So, I mean, what sort of advice would you give those listening? Because we're talking about people from all over the place in all sorts of different circumstances. I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean,
what's something to look for?
well, the first place you can start is asking a priest that your parish priest, someone that you're close to. They're not all trained in spiritual direction, nor are they all equipped for it, but they can either start or they can direct you to the right place. You can also contact your diocese. I know like the diocesan office has kind of like a core list of good ones. But I mean, always you can start with your parish priest and then
Hmm.
say, hey, I'm thinking about this, and then they can be like, whoa, or go over here, or like, don't do that. But that's a good. Just find a trusted priest and kind of go from there. There are spiritual directors that aren't priests. The only and they're good too. The benefit of having a priest as a spiritual director is that you can add confession to the practice, the
Hmm.
sacrament of reconciliation. It just helps, but there are others as well. But start with a trusted priest.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I'd add to that is if if you're not going to confession regularly, start there,
That's true.
right? So, but then I think also from that you sort of get a feel of, I mean, you can see the priest's heart in confession so clearly, and you sort of get a sense of sort of two places, either in the pulpit or in the confessional, right? Because if you have someone who preaches courageously at the ambo, and they're merciful and just almost like a surgeon. They can just ask the right questions to kind of get down to the root of the sin you're dealing with. I mean, that's the best right
Yeah.
there. So if you find someone like that, I would say absolutely talk to them. But just to echo what you said is, I was talking to I was in confession with a priest one time, and I said, Father, I'd really love to talk to you about this sometime. And he was like, great, bring it up after confession. I was like, okay, when? And he was like, no, like right after absolution, bring it up so then we can talk about it. I'm like, perfect. So
Nice.
he knew the rules, and
Yeah. Nice.
we got through confession, and then we just had another conversation after that, and it was very low key. It wasn't like really rigid. Okay, let's set up a meeting. So it doesn't always have to be this sort of long term commitment, because
Mm-hmm.
I've tried that as well, where I've met with a priest intentionally for spiritual direction, and we got through one sort of meeting, and I think we both sort of said, all right, that great. And then I never went back to him, and it was nothing against him or me. It just,
Just
you got
didn't
to
work.
find the right fit.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
But it is important to have that connection with someone who can look at your life sort of from a disinterested standpoint and say, this is what I'm sensing God doing in your life. This is how I feel God speaking to you here.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are notoriously awful at listening, just generally speaking, as human beings. Like we're really bad when it's God speaking to us. That absolutely takes a lot of practice, a
It
lot of
does.
discernment,
Yeah.
um, a lot of failure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But God is merciful, and we keep getting back up.
Yeah. So, should we go to the next virtue, which is
Sure.
actually two virtues in one
Hmm.
chapter, and it's humility and obedience. And Bonaventure puts those together because they go together. So it's two separate virtues of humility and obedience. But so humility is seeing your littleness in relationship to God, right? God is all great, and we're sinners, and we're small and unable to do much of anything on our own. And so we have this dependence on God, and we're just meek and humble. And then obedience is extremely contrary to today's idea of what we should be doing, right? Who obey? No, I'm going to be the CEO. I'm not going to be I'm not going to be the bottom rung of the ladder. So, so Francis was very humble. He just always viewed himself as a sinner, as, he knew that everything he had, whatever it was because God gave it to him. So any
Hmm.
virtue that he had, any possession that he had, anything that he had was because God willed him to have it. And that was humbling. And he was always just grateful and thankful and in awe of God. Now this is the crazy part, especially when you're thinking about today. He valued obedience so much. Now, he started the Franciscan order.
Hmm.
He didn't want to be in charge of the Franciscan order. So when he would travel and do things, he would put a companion, he would say, you are in charge. You tell me what to do. That's how much, like, he would say, I'm not going to make any decisions. You tell me what to do. And that is so contrary to anything that we see today, right?
Yeah.
So he took that like really seriously. And then he would preach. So he was known as a great preacher. He was a deacon. He was never a priest. He was a deacon, but he was a preacher. And he would tell his faults from the ambo, like you were saying. He was like, look, here's where I go wrong. Here's where I'm a sinner. And this was humility. It was just all those things. And then he always like when, sorry, I'm going to pause for a second. Okay. So when the person was in power over him or in some kind of position of authority over him, he knew that it was because God willed it.
Hmm.
Therefore, it was his obligation to be obedient. So if you just put that in today's context, like let's just say our children, right? Our children are under us, right? They're in our care because God made it so. He willed it. So it is their obligation to be obedient. Or if your pastor is your pastor, whether you like him or not, God willed him to be your pastor. So you are to be obedient. And I can go all over, I can go in all the hierarchy of the church and the world and the
Mm-hmm.
way that it goes. And so we're to be very docile, right? So Francis would use the imagery of a dead body. Basically, this is how docile we are to be. If a person like moves that body's head, the head moves and there it stays. That's how he told his brothers, that's how docile you are to be. And it is all
Hmm.
because of how little you are compared to God, and that all of this that's happening is because that's what he wants for you. So, pretty intense.
Very intense and very much opposed to the current culture of today. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because obedience is it's definitely a virtue that's lacking in the church or out of the church. Sort of this idea that like the local ordinary is the head of the diocese. People struggle with this all the time. I know priests who struggle with this. I'm not talking about the Diocese of Phoenix, just by the way, everyone listening, but like there's priests I know who struggle with their bishop for whatever reason, and it's almost to the point of disobedience, almost to the point of, well, he wants me to do this, so I'm just gonna sneakily do this other thing. It's like, oh man, that's a terrible idea. Um, not the least of which because for that priest, he will be judged by God based on his obedience to his bishop, this rightful authority.
Mhm.
But even like you're saying, outside of hierarchy, this is true in the family. It's true um, in communities in civil society. I
Mhm.
mean, there's this notion even beyond, like, I think people see something like the divine right of kings where like, okay, the king is over the country and so obviously the king has authority, but we're talking about even in a pluralistic democratic society, which the church isn't even very fond of, generally speaking. um, they still say no, the elected and appointed officials over you who have legitimate competent authority, as long as they're not compelling you to sin, you still must be obedient. That is incredibly countercultural and un-American. I don't know if that's the right word, but like, and I'm totally fine with that. But it's so interesting to draw from the tradition of the church and realize how at odds our current society and thus the way we're formed is.
Yeah. 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 Now we should make the distinction that anything we are not obligated to obey anything that goes against what we know to be true within
Right.
our conscience, a well-formed conscience, I should say, not just any conscience, but a well-formed conscience. We are not obligated to obey what is contrary to the faith or, morals and all those things. That's another conversation for another day. Um, but within rightly ordered um, hierarchies or situations, yeah, obedience is required, and it's hard, especially because we're, at least here, we're told to success, right? We want to work our way up. We want to
Mhm.
get the promotion, we want to get the raise, and then we want to build a team around us, and we want to tell that team what to do. And St. Francis did the exact opposite of that and said, you tell me what to do, I'll be your team, even though he was the one who founded the whole
That's
order.
so
He's like,
funny to
I don't
me.
want anything to do with it. And he ended up establishing, he put in somebody else and to run it, and he was like, no, I'm going to just obey, which is just, we just don't think like that. We don't,
Hmm.
we are always looking for more power. And I think I say in my article that for Francis, he would be just as willing to obey an entry level position, someone coming into an entry level position, as he would a CEO. He would obey that bottom rung guy as readily as he obeyed the CEO of his company.
Hmm.
And I don't know many people that can say that today. That's kind of crazy, right?
It is. It is. It does seem crazy. Um, because obedience, I mean, like, it comes from the Latin to hear, right? To listen, like to truly hear and then make it so. That's not something that we think of as giving us freedom. I mean,
Mm-mm.
that seems like a shackle, especially if it's something that we think we're right. We think that the person telling us something is wrong. Maybe it's not against faith and morals. Maybe it's just a matter of prudential judgment, that it's just a varying perspective. Um, I was reading a book. I can't remember who wrote it. It was on contemplative prayer by a brother for other religious. But I think the idea still stands, is like, if you have to go across the street and it's 15 degrees out and snowing, and you need a coat, but your superior tells you don't bring your coat, then you don't bring the coat. Like, even it doesn't make any sense. There's no common sense to that. Nonetheless, you still are obliged to be obedient. And I struggled with that, to be honest. I struggled with that so much when I read that. I had to put the book down, and I spent like another 10, 15 minutes in contemplative prayer of like, Lord, what? What? Why? That doesn't make any sense. But that's how highly God does view obedience,
Mhm.
which goes all the way back to the garden, right? I mean, that's the one thing he told Adam and Eve was, you can do anything you like, just don't eat of this tree, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, like making yourself God, saying, well, I know better. So it's the same sort of idea of pride as being opposed to obedience. But it's still utterly fascinating. I didn't know that St. Francis put other people in charge of him.
He did.
That's
He
so
did.
shocking.
It's shocking for us today, but again, I go back to like simpler times. But anyway, and also going back to the humility thing, and I think this kind of speaks to what you were saying, was that he would actually prefer to hang. This is the humility part. This is crazy too. He would prefer to hang out with people who didn't like him and to hear their rebukes, because he viewed them as an opportunity for self-reflection and change and conversion. So he would go, he would preach, and then he'd go find the guy who didn't like his sermon and hear what he had to say about it, and then take that in and take it back to contemplation. So I think it's like this whole like, well, if he tells you you're going to go out without a coat, why would I do that? Well, there's something in there for you. There's some kind of lesson in
Mm,
there for you, right? Or some, maybe a practice of austerity, right? Like maybe you need to be exposing your flesh to the cold. There's something in that interaction that God wills for your good, whether you see it or not. And your obedience to that expresses your receptivity to whatever that is that God wants you to learn in that moment. So kind of weird, but yeah.
I'm really glad Lent is coming up, because I need purification and enlightenment, because I am so far from this.
Oh,
Um,
we all are. I, yeah, it's this. Francis is intense. He's very, very
in
intense.
in the best of ways. I mean, the saints are such good examples of just being intense and awesome and showing us the way.
Yeah.
So what's the next virtue?
Okay, so now we have poverty. Um, Again, something he took very seriously. So nothing. He and his brothers, they had nothing. They had little small huts to live in. They slept on the floor. They didn't do anything. They didn't have anything. They didn't own anything or anything like that. So there's this story that Saint Bonaventure tells where this guy comes and he says to Saint Francis he wants to join the order. And so Saint Francis says, okay, sell all you have and come follow me, similar to Jesus. Sell all you have and give it to the poor. So the man goes and he takes all his belongings and he distributes them amongst members of his family. And he comes back and says, okay, I got rid of all my belongings. I gave them to all my family. And Francis is like, no, I'm sorry. You deprived the poor. Your motivation was not correct. You are still attached to these things because you gave them to your family. So your heart is not correct. You're not in this for the right reasons. And he rejected him from the order. So, motivation and detachment, or being motivated by detachment, is really the heart of the poverty, right? So it's not just not having anything, but it's wanting the poor to have it and not knowing that it's right there, still right there, safe and protected, right?
Hmm.
Then the other kind of key part, this was hard for me to accept. It was more virtuous to beg than it was to accept something that was freely given. And the reason for that is the humility. It
Hmm.
is more humble to have to ask for something than it is to just take what someone offers you. So I think so when I translate that to our world today, I'm thinking of myself as a busy mom, right? Like, have all this stuff going on. I'm juggling all these balls. It's so much harder for me to say, hey, someone, I need help. Can
Hmm.
someone help me with this? Than it is for someone to just show up on my doorstep with a casserole. That's easy, right?
Yeah.
So Francis, it's so counterintuitive to us, right? That begging is virtuous, right? Especially when someone's offering it, especially when it's just right there and someone's knocking on our door and giving it to us. It's more virtuous to have to ask. So
Hmm.
he would send his brothers out to, like, that's how they got their food, was to ask for it. And yes, people brought food and things like that, but um, it it all goes back to the humility of having to, like, recognize how little you are, how detached you are, how much you are dependent on others for your survival, how much you're dependent on God for your survival. He always used the the story of God providing the manna for the Israelites in the desert, right? The manna
Hmm.
came down from heaven. God will provide. How much do we trust that our every need will be provided for and that we don't have to have anything, really? We don't have to have anything and God will take care of us.
Well, and it struck me when you were describing the casserole versus asking for help that it also is an opportunity for communion with another, um, or a real sense of unity or community, I should say. But like even in your own home, um, like I'm pretty stubborn, and so's my bride, and we will go to great lengths to not ask for help, and we just expect the other to read our minds, basically. But then when we sort of suck it up, have a conversation in humility, and say, "Look, I need help um, with this and this," and then the other has the opportunity to respond and say, "Well, I need help with this and this," and then we can actually support one another and be there for one another. So it's this humility, yeah, for sure, but also this spirit of poverty of saying, like, I need you, um, and especially for someone like myself or my wife who doesn't want to need anyone, sort of by nature, by temperament. Um,
Me too.
that's
It's
tough,
it I am
but fruitful.
so competent. I'm so competent. There's nothing I can't like handle, right? Like that, and that's how we're formed in this world, right?
Mm,
Like the strong, independent, you know, capable. It's like, but really, it just goes back to who are we without, what do we have without God,
mm,
right? What do we have without each other, the body of Christ, without our spouse or without our community, without our parish? Um, we we don't live in a vacuum, and we need each other. And he created us to need each other,
mm,
very much. He created us to need each other. And so that's what St. Francis did, is he's like, we have nothing. That was, one of the pillars of his order, is like, we have nothing, and we are 100% dependent on God and our fellow man, our fellow brother, to provide for us,
mm.
and that's, I want to be careful. That's not for everybody. If we
Yeah,
were all poor, like, I mean, like
logistically, it just wouldn't work.
it wouldn't work, right? So different people are called to different levels of poverty,
Mm,
but I think it's, any of us can give up something. Do we need, whatever, that, Pottery Barn throw pillow that's on our couch? Do we need that? Like, we probably don't, or take it the other direction. Can we ask for help when we need it? Can we humble ourselves and ask for what we need that we can't provide for ourselves, whatever that
mm.
is? It's not necessarily a material good, but, some kind of support or something. We're just not inclined to do that. So, like, for this Lent, it's like, okay, what can you detach from materially? But then on the flip side, what can you depend on someone else to provide for you that you can't provide for yourself?
Mm.
You know,
So we detach from the world, practice ascesis with austerity, and then we lean into humility and obedience, and then poverty. And so what's next?
so now we have piety. Now, piety is basically the reverence that we give to God that he's owed because he's God. But now, as I said in the beginning, so all these virtues, Francis always starts with God, and then it trickles down from there. So for Francis, piety extended to creation. And this is where we see your typical St. Francis with the bird on his shoulder and the bunnies around him and
Mm,
everything. This is where this image comes from, is because if God created it, it was worthy of the reverence that was owed its creator.
mm,
So he loved God first, he revered God first, but then by extension, anything that God created was as respected and as revered by St. Francis as God was, because it was
mm,
an extension of God. So that was any animal, any creation, any human being. He looked at that person or that thing through the eyes of the God that created them,
mm,
which is hard. But then this is where, if you go and read the Canticle of the Sun, he wrote the Canticle of the Sun, where he talks about the brother sun, the brother moon, and he goes through and all the stanzas go through different levels of creation. And and I should go back. He actually goes from God to angels and saints, and
mm,
then to other creation. So he gives the respect and honor due to the creations that give God even greater honor than sinful people down here. So he writes this Canticle of the Sun, and if you read through it, this is how he views the world is that if God created it, how can I not love it? And how can I not respect it the same way that I respect the creator? So again, here we are today, where is that how we look at people? Is that how we look at things? And I don't know. Pretty hard.
Well, and especially those in the church today who sort of balk at any mention of like the stewardship of creation as being something that's truly part of being Catholic. I think that's another particularly American thing is if you happen to be politically conservative, then it's like, that's the lefties. That's their thing. It's like, no, we're called to stewardship because going back to the garden, that's what we were made for. That's literally the first job that Adam had was stewardship of creation, and by extension, Eve. So I love that too. The just keeping everything in proper context. That God comes first. The angels and the saints come next because they chose God freely and persevered. And then I'd be interested. I don't know if he goes into this or not. Like, who comes next? Is it man because he's made in the image and likeness of God, or is it creation, which teleologically is pointed to God and moves towards that end regardless because it doesn't have free will? I would imagine it's probably those made in the image of God.
Probably. I don't remember if it was explicitly stated. I know it was explicitly stated God, and then I kind of skipped over. But yeah, he goes into the angels and the saints first. So he has an ordered way of looking at things. Always God first, but then yes, these higher created beings that chose God. Probably, but if I remember correctly, it kind of all blended together after that. But if you were to look at Saint Francis, if you were to have an actual conversation with him, it would probably be ordered to man. But there was no, I mean, it's not like a rabbit was owed any less reverence because it was still kind of came from the same creator, right? So it was more about God than the thing. More about God than the creation, right? He loved whatever it was because God created it. So it probably didn't matter too much what it was. He loved it the same way.
But he would still be like to my knowledge, he wasn't like a vegetarian. Like he would have been fine with hunting and killing and eating an animal as long as it's done with respect and
Correct.
civility. So
Yeah,
I
correct.
think, and again, it just shows how well ordered his thinking was and how his worldview is just so consistent.
It was very, yeah. And when I get to the end, yeah, which is, well, the next one, which is charity, this is the one that kind of was the most interesting to me. So charity was this next virtue. So again, so charity, let me just actually read this from the catechism. So this is in catechism number 1822, paragraph 1822. Charity is the theological virtue by which we love God above all things for his own sake, and our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. So now I find that, or I perceive when we talk about charity today, we're talking about to our neighbor. I never hear charity to God. I hear, say that, why don't you tell your spouse in charity this, or why don't you go to your fellow parishioner in charity and express this? And it's always like, or we should be charitable to our neighbors, right? Francis turns this completely on its head. Charity to God above all things. I love it. So if we use the word charity and we make it synonym love, I love God first. I don't love my neighbor first. I love God first. And so he just imbues himself, he's consumed with this love for God. He just stays in relationship with God, and he's consumed by this relationship with God. Then that drives everything going forward with how he interacts with his neighbor. But because he loves his neighbor, he wants his neighbor to know the love of God. So the most charitable act he can do for his neighbor is introduce him to Jesus Christ. This is not how we think today. We think of charity and being charitable as being nice. Be nice. And that's not how he thought of it. He thought of it as, I love God, and because I love God, I love this guy over here, and because I love this guy over here, I want him to know God. So this is where the Sultan comes in. He's like, well, I want all these people over, there to know Jesus Christ. And so he gets on a boat. He's probably with several brothers that he put in charge of him. And he cruises over and he's like, all right, we're going to go introduce all these people to Jesus Christ because we love them, because we love God, and we're going to die for it. And then he goes and all this, it doesn't work, but he does go and he introduces Jesus Christ. He evangelizes. So I think if that happened today, would that be called charitable? If we went out would that be perceived as charitable when today we're supposed to be tolerant of other people's, beliefs or, whatever? Francis would say that the way we view charity today maybe would be the opposite of charity, because we're just keeping our opinions to ourselves, letting them live the way that they want to live as an act of charity and tolerance and acceptance, but it's not really introducing them to Jesus Christ. So I think this virtue really did a loop-de-loop for me on the, in the context of today's culture.
Well, because tolerance is seen as the prime virtue today. Even though it means a very particular thing, it means you have to be tolerant of everybody's view except for yours. We're not tolerant of your view because you're Christian and think everyone should be. So we're not going to be tolerant of that, but you need to be tolerant of me. So it ends up not meaning anything. But even more than that, it's actually not a virtue at all. It's usually some sort of flimsy excuse to not evangelize. Because, of course, as St. John Paul II says, the faith is always proposed, not imposed. So we can't force people to convert. We shouldn't even want to. It has to be a freely given gift. But we also can't keep it for ourselves. One of my favorite quotes, I don't know who said it first, but like evangelization as being one beggar telling another beggar where to find the bread. Like that's how we ought to look at it, because we love God. We love the other person and we want them to love God too. I mean, that has to be, that's what I tell my students in religion classes. If your goal is not to get to heaven and bring as many people with you as possible, you need to figure out how to make that your goal, because that's it. But where do we, how do we do that? How do we make that switch? How do we go from this sort of lackluster, lukewarm, we have to be tolerant, to boldly proclaiming the gospel again in a way that is truly in charity, not trying to be nice, but because we live in a pluralistic society, we live in this world that values that above all. It seems to me that we'd have to sort of dismantle the whole system at some point.
So Francis, so I'm going to say start where Francis starts. He starts with God, right? And so adoration in the Blessed Sacrament is where you start. You start by loving God, and you just, St. Francis was in adoration a lot, like a lot. he was just always in adoration, at least according to St. Bonaventure. And when you just love God that much and you kind of cultivate that relationship and cultivate that passion for God, then the rest comes. Now, again, like St. Francis, it's being willing, and not even willing, but wanting to accept persecution for it, right? That you've been in adoration so much. You've received the sacrament of the Eucharist so much. You are just so like at one with God, and your love is, I mean, he had ecstasies and stuff like that because he was just so infused with God. And you love God that much that you're willing to suffer for that love, and that you're willing to go out on a limb and be chastised and be ostracized and be humiliated to evangelize and tell other people about that love who don't want to hear it and will say and do things that are uncomfortable, and that's charity. It's not, let's be nice. I don't know. I these days I can't stand the word nice.
Well, it
If
doesn't mean anything. It's a useless, awful word that should be struck from the English language.
if
I'm
if
fully on board.
if we love somebody, so like we know that our job is to get our spouse to heaven. We love our spouse. We love that person. We want to see them in heaven. And we'll do whatever, hopefully whatever that takes, in whatever form that takes. And sometimes it's painful, it can be hard, but if you love somebody, and if you are truly have a heart of charity for that person, then you want to see them in heaven. And that comes at a cost, a personal cost, which then gets rewarded later on.
Well, you said that Bonaventure sort of laid out these virtues in a way that sort of was hierarchical and sort of led to this pinnacle of prayer. And I mean, you've already alluded to this, but that final point is sort of the culmination of all of these things.
Yeah. So Bonaventure kind of ends this little section with his prayer, and this is what I always strive for, and I don't know that I'm even close yet, but St. Francis was to the point where he was always in prayer, like always in prayer, in conversation with God. So it's kind of funny. He talks about how like they'd be traveling, and St. Francis would be like, are we almost there? And they'd be like, we've been here like for like 4 hours, like, because he's so unaware of, I want to travel like that. I want to be able to be so consumed in prayer that I don't even realize that I just went on this really long road trip, right? Or went through this whole like day, or got through traffic, or whatever, carpool, whatever it was, like to not even realize that all these things are happening around you because you're so deep in prayer. That's essentially how St. Francis lived. So there wasn't, he reached this point where he was never not in prayer. He was never not in communication with God. And then that is what powered every virtue that, we just talked about that came before it. Was, if you are that absorbed in communion with God in your heart, how can any of these other things that we just talked about be difficult? And I think that's probably where, we're falling short today, or at least speaking for myself. It's like, when you're stuck in traffic, when you're mad about this or mad about that, or at work consumed in this project, or even me sitting here, like writing, like, I'm consumed with the world, with my mind, with, what communication, or raising my kids, or my grocery list is just like always on my mind, things like that. It's like, that's not prayer. And so we just have to we strive to get to this point where we start with God, and we stay with God, and then everything else follows after that. And so that's kind of how Francis did that. So, and that powered everything. So,
There's a beautiful insight from the Eastern Church of the Jesus prayer as a way to pray unceasingly. This prayer that almost becomes like breathing, where you breathe in and you say, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, and then breathe out, have mercy on me, a sinner. And you just do that over and over. And I practiced that after I was introduced to it. And it's so beautiful how this sort of autonomic thing of breathing becomes prayer. And then throughout the day, you recognize your breathing because you don't normally think about that. But then it comes to mind and you go, oh, right, Jesus,
mm-hmm.
have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. Oh, yeah. And then just like everything kind of clicks back into place. And it's interesting how each group within Christianity, whether it's East or West, whether it's Francis or the Benedictines and their idea of like prayer and work, they all have their different ways of doing this. So it's not like there's one way to accomplish it, which I think is so awesome, so beautiful, because we're all
it's
so different.
it's funny that you mentioned the Jesus prayer and the inhale and the exhale, because that's something I practice regularly, and something that I actually, when I'm trying to fall asleep and the anxieties and the mind and everything won't slow down, that's particularly when I'll like draw very deeply into that prayer and the inhale and exhale and just like fill myself with the Holy Spirit. And, and it's a little more difficult. It's easier to remember when you're trying to sleep and your mind is racing than it is when you're like doing your busy work. But when you do
Mm.
remember to do that, it's such a blessing. It really just slows everything down, reminds you that God is in control, and none of this matters anyway. It really doesn't, because this is our temporary home. And really what matters is our relationship with God. So the Jesus prayer is a great tool. Again, adoration is a great tool because everything stops in adoration. Well, sometimes my mind doesn't stop, but time kind of stops in adoration. And we just really need to teach ourselves to just keep breathing him in, like you said, and just, we're not thinking
Mm.
about our breath, but he's there in that breath, and just keep inhaling and exhaling the Holy Spirit, and then that'll power the rest. If you're doing that, then austerity and poverty and charity and obedience and all those things become more second nature, because the fuel
Mm-hmm.
is the divine, which we're just constantly filling ourselves up with.
Well, and so this Lent, people will have a chance to dive into this series, learn more about these virtues at CatholicHeartAblaze.com. I'll also be posting it, hopefully on Good Distinctions, at least links to your posts. And just for those listening, it's not something that you need to do all at once. St. Francis did not become enraptured in prayer overnight. This was his whole life. So maybe it starts with that pebble in the shoe, or maybe it starts with trying the Jesus prayer a few times. Uh, but wherever you are, I feel like what matters the most, at least in my experience, is consistency, right? Showing up and letting God do the rest. Because, like, I often joke, but I'm completely not joking. I'll usually before adults or someone I'm catechizing, and I'll say, like Jesus said in the Gospels, apart from me, you can do a little bit somewhat decently, right? No, like, apart from me, you can do nothing. Apart from me, you can do absolutely nothing. And it's true,
Mm-hmm.
because there's all these different things that we can do sort of naturally, and that's fine. But like you say, this world is passing, and the things that last, the things that are infused with grace, the things that become redemptive, become prayer, become grace for ourselves and the world, are the things that we intentionally unite to Jesus. And so if we find that we're not doing anything on a given day, then doing one thing daily for a week, I mean, gosh, that's huge. Because we don't want to compare ourselves to others. That's not the point. But how many people are just sort of going through life aimlessly? Well, like you say, if we start with us, with with me. Like I start with me and I say, okay, I need to come to God. I need to focus on him and allow him to form me and mold me to be whoever he desires me to be, whoever he made me to be. Then that will radiate out. I think people want to take on the world, when all we need to do is take on ourselves, and the rest sort of falls into place.
Yeah, yeah, and this word of encouragement is a good place to end, because the path to holiness starts exactly where you are. Like you're like the first step is right here, it's like the yellow brick road, right? She starts at the very beginning of the yellow brick road. That's where you start, wherever you are on that road. And even though St. Francis is a tremendous model and one that we can all hope to reach his level of virtue, even he started at the very beginning. Like he was a wealthy man that had to walk away from everything. And, Bonaventure even explains that his own conversion was not quick. He had to have a
Hmm.
series of things happen to him to get to the point where he even got here. So this is a lifetime of work. And you're right. You start with one thing, your first step, on a path to holiness. And then that one thing becomes another thing. And oh, you know what? I think I can add one more thing. And then you just keep doing that. And then, hopefully maybe we'll get to, these levels, something to strive for at least. And I was hoping to just provide inspiration as opposed to a destination, like trigger a little thought of, what's one more thing that I can do.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for taking this on, and thank you for sharing it with the world. And
Thank you.
thanks for coming on, and thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Jen. So again, for those listening, CatholicHeartAblaze.com. Check it out. Go find Jen Arnold on LinkedIn as well and follow her there. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Good Distinctions, you can go to gooddistinctions.com to become a free or paid subscriber. If you enjoy these episodes, if you enjoy the conversation, please consider becoming a paid subscriber for $5 a month or $50 a year. And that'll help continue all of the things that we have planned here at Good Distinctions, hopefully keeping everything oriented towards God and moving forward in the right direction. If you have any comments, questions, thoughts, feel free to send an email to gooddistinctions@gmail.com. And I will see you next week. Jen, thanks again.
Thank you.